The deep ocean holds stories that never reach the shore. There is a strange comfort in the roar of a distant storm, a power that can both terrify and cradle you into rest. Tonight, we are going to harness that very sensation. You are about to experience a historical mystery designed not to keep you awake with tension, but to guide you gently into sleep. We will dive into the heart of a legendary storm at sea, exploring a famous shipwreck shrouded in unanswered questions. By the end, you will possess the complete, immersive story of a maritime disaster, wrapped in a soundscape that transforms historical drama into a profound tool for relaxation. What was the final, desperate order shouted into the wind before the silence fell? How can a tale of such fury become a modern lullaby? What is your relationship with the timeless power of the sea? The year was 1912, and the world was moving with a new kind of confidence. On land, cities glowed with electric light, and communication spanned continents in an instant. It was an age that believed in the triumph of human engineering, a belief perfectly embodied in a new class of ocean liner. One vessel in particular was hailed as the pinnacle of this progress. She was called the Empress of Ireland, a Canadian Pacific steamship of impressive size and grace. Picture her at her dock in Quebec City, her two red and black funnels standing tall against the sky, her hull a sleek, dark curve against the calm waters of the St. Lawrence River. She was a floating city designed for comfort and speed on the regular run between Canada and England. Her interiors were appointed with polished wood and plush carpets, her dining saloons ready to serve multi-course meals to passengers ranging from wealthy tourists to hopeful immigrants traveling in steerage. On the evening of May 28th, she prepared for another routine crossing. The crew went about their well-practiced duties, checking cargo manifests and securing lines. Passengers bustled up the gangways, filled with the familiar mix of excitement and melancholy that accompanies any long voyage. There were families returning home, businessmen, and hundreds of Salvation Army members traveling to a conference in London. The mood was one of mundane anticipation. The ship's whistle gave a deep, resonant blast that echoed off the city's cliffs, a sound of pure departure. As the Empress pulled away from the pier and began her journey down the wide, majestic river, the sunset painted the water in hues of gold and violet. On deck, people chatted and watched the Canadian shoreline slip by, thinking of the open Atlantic that lay ahead, but not yet of the river's hidden dangers. They felt the steady, reassuring thrum of the ship's engines through the deck, a mechanical heartbeat that promised safety and certainty. The night was clear, the air cool and still. It was in every sense a perfect beginning. This normalcy, this simple trust in a vessel and a routine, is what makes the story that follows so deeply haunting. For the St. Lawrence River, despite its serene appearance, is a treacherous waterway, known to sailors for its sudden, dense fogs that can blanket everything in a blinding, silent shroud within minutes. And on this particular night, another ship was moving quietly through that same darkness, carrying a cargo that would transform this routine voyage into a historical mystery that still whispers from the depths. The Empress of Ireland was not alone on the river that night. Approaching from the opposite direction, heading upstream toward the Atlantic, was a Norwegian collier named the Storstad. She was a workhorse of the sea, a steel-hulled freighter heavily laden with 11,000 tons of coal. Her design was all business, a blunt, sturdy vessel built for endurance, not elegance. Her captain, Thomas Anderson, was an experienced mariner, and his crew was focused on the long journey ahead. The two ships were aware of each other's presence, their courses plotted to pass safely port to port in the wide channel, a routine maneuver performed countless times. As darkness fully settled, a thin, cool mist began to gather over the water. It was not yet a fog, just a gentle haze that softened the edges of the distant lights. On the bridge of the Empress, Captain Henry Kendall watched the conditions with a seasoned eye. He knew the river's reputation. he ordered a slight reduction in speed as a precaution and posted extra lookouts. The scene was one of professional caution, a standard response to a standard maritime challenge. Yet the atmosphere held a peculiar tension. The river, so vast and calm just hours before, seemed to be holding its breath. The mist thickened with an almost deliberate silence, swallowing the stars one by one until the world outside the ship's rails dissolved into a uniform, impenetrable gray. This was no ordinary haze. This was the St. Lawrence's infamous fog, a living wall of vapor that descended with startling speed, erasing all visual reference points. In a matter of minutes, the Empress of Ireland was sailing blind. The reassuring thrum of her engines now felt isolated, a heartbeat in a void. On the bridge, Captain Kendall could hear the distant, mournful blast of the Storstad's fog whistle somewhere off his starboard bow. He gave his own whistle a series of short, sharp blasts to signal his position and his intention to hold course. The two captains, invisible to one another, were now conducting a delicate dance by sound alone, each interpreting the other's signals through the muffling blanket of fog. Every decision, every assumption carried the weight of over 1,000 lives, and in that gray, silent world, a fundamental misunderstanding was taking shape, a miscommunication so simple and so catastrophic that it would echo for over a century. What did each captain believe the other was doing? Why did their whistles, those desperate voices in the void, tell two completely different stories? But the storm that struck the Empress of Ireland was not one of wind and towering waves. Its weapon was silence and blindness. The meteorological mayhem that night was the fog itself, a phenomenon as ancient and unpredictable as the sea. To understand its power, we must step into the world of early 20th century maritime science. Weather forecasting was in its infancy, more art than science. Captains relied on barometers, the look of the sky, and passed on wisdom from old sailors. There were no satellite images, no radar pings to see through the gloom. A storm on the open ocean you could hear and feel coming, its winds rising for hours, but a river fog like this was a stealthy adversary. It formed when warm, moist air from the arriving spring season flowed over the still frigid waters of the St. Lawrence, which were laden with melting ice from the distant Great Lakes. The collision created a thick, adiabatic fog, a blanket that could materialize in moments and cling for miles. The force here was not measured in knots of wind, but in a complete sensory deprivation. The fog had a physical weight, a damp chill that seeped into the bones of the ship and the minds of the men. It swallowed sound, distorting the direction of a whistle blast so a signal from the north might seem to come from the east. It erased the horizon, that fundamental line every sailor uses to judge stability and course. On the bridge of the Empress, Captain Kendall's barometer might have been steady, his charts perfectly accurate, but they were useless against this white wall. His technology amounted to his own eyes and ears, the very senses the fog had now stolen. This was nature asserting a brutal, timeless truth. Human engineering, for all its gleaming confidence, remained utterly fragile before the ancient, elemental systems of the planet. The storm was not in the air above them, but in the air around them, a silent, swirling vortex of condensed water that turned the familiar river into a disorienting maze. Every decision from this point forward was a guess made in a void, a calculation based on fragmented sounds and desperate hope. The real tempest was one of uncertainty, and its waves were crashing against the bridge of both ships with gathering, invisible force. The dance by whistle had become a frantic, confusing conversation. Captain Kendall, aboard the Empress, heard the Storstad's signal off his starboard side and believed the freighter was safely passing. He ordered a series of short whistle blasts to confirm his own position and a slight turn to starboard, aiming to open more distance between the two vessels in the fog. He then commanded full speed astern, the engines groaning in protest as they fought to reverse their momentum. On the bridge of the Storstad, Captain Anderson and his pilot interpreted the sounds differently. They heard the Empress's whistles as signals that she was turning to port across their bow. In a split-second decision, they ordered their own helm hard to port, hoping to swing their stern away from the oncoming liner. It was a tragic miscalculation. For a long, agonizing minute, there was only the muffled silence of the fog, broken by the distant, receding whistles. Then a shape materialized from the gray wall. It was not the expected profile of a ship passing safely. It was the towering, dark bulk of the Storstad's bow, emerging directly ahead and closing with terrifying speed. On the Empress's bridge, a lookout's cry was cut short by the sound. It was not a deafening explosion, but a deep, grinding, metallic shriek that shuddered through the entire frame of the liner. The Storstad's ice-reinforced prow struck the Empress of Ireland amidships on her starboard side, tearing a gash nearly 30 feet wide into her hull. The collision was a brutal, intimate violence. Passengers in their cabins were thrown from their bunks by the jolt. In the Grand Saloon, glasses and plates cascaded from tables, shattering on the floor. The initial shock was followed by a strange, suspended moment of quiet, as if the ship itself was gasping in disbelief. Then the reality of the damage announced itself. The sound of inrushing water was a roar, a hungry, relentless force. The cold St. Lawrence River, only a few degrees above freezing, poured into the engine room and boiler rooms, instantly drowning the fires and silencing the great engines. The ship's heartbeat stopped, the electric lights flickered, dimmed, and then went out completely, plunging the interior passages into a darkness absolute and choking. Within 60 seconds, the Empress began to list heavily to starboard, the angle so severe that furniture slid across floors and people struggled to keep their footing. Captain Kendall, realizing the mortal wound, immediately ordered the wireless operators to send the distress call. The young Marconi men, Cyril Evans and Ronald Ferguson, tapped out the new Universal Signal of Disaster, CQD, along with their position. Their message was clear: Empress of Ireland sinking 10 miles off Father Point, need immediate assistance, but the ship's list was now a catastrophic tilt. Watertight doors designed to seal off compartments could not be closed because the steep angle jammed their mechanisms. The sea was flooding in from above as well as lower deck portholes, left open by passengers for air dipped below the waterline. The orderly world of the ship was dissolving into chaos. Corridors became steep, slippery ramps. The shouts of crew members trying to direct passengers to boat decks mixed with the cries of confusion and the screams of those already trapped by the rising water. The lifeboats on the port side now swung uselessly high above the water, while those on the starboard side were already submerged. In the darkness and the bitter cold, the final, desperate race for survival had begun, measured not in hours but in minutes. Into that darkness came a symphony of chaos, a terrible orchestra of destruction. The first sound was the wind, not a howl but a low, constant moan as it tore through the rigging and funnel stays, a spectral whistle that spoke of immense, indifferent force. Beneath it came the deep, percussive boom of waves striking the hull, each impact shuddering through the ship's frame like a giant's fist. You could hear the ship herself protesting, a chorus of groans and sharp cracks as her wooden deck strained and her metal plates twisted under the unnatural angle. These were the macro sounds, the environment's fury, but layered over them were the human sounds, the close, desperate details. Frantic shouts from crewmen trying to launch lifeboats merged into a blurred wall of noise, punctuated by the sharp clatter of davits jamming or ropes snapping under strain. From within the darkened interior, muffled cries and the splintering of doors being forced open carried up companionways now tilted like slides. And there was the water itself, a sound that grew from a hissing rush to a thunderous roar as it flooded through the great gash, swallowing whole compartments in a relentless, gurgling rush. This audio landscape was not a single storm, but a collapsing world. To hear it now, to let those layered sounds wash over you, is to touch the raw edge of that historical moment. Yet within this guided journey, these very sounds of tempest and turmoil can become something else entirely. When removed from their context of panic and framed by the safety of your own space, the roar of the sea transforms. The wind becomes a constant white noise blanket. The deep groan of the hull turns into a resonant, soothing drone. The crash of waves settles into a rhythmic, predictable pattern. This is the alchemy of our experience tonight. We will soon let these historical sounds, this reconstructed storm, fill the air not as a warning but as a lullaby. The very forces that spelled disaster for the Empress can, in this controlled retelling, cradle you toward rest, proving that even the most powerful narratives can be reframed by time, distance, and a listening, peaceful mind. The moment of crisis arrived not with a single cataclysm, but with a cascade of failures. The Storstad's bow had already torn open the Empress's side, but the true seal on her fate was the devastating list. As thousands of tons of frigid river water flooded the starboard compartments, the ship began to heel over with terrifying speed. Within 3 minutes of the collision, she was leaning at an angle of 45 degrees. This was the pivotal event. At such a severe tilt, the ship's design became its own enemy. The watertight doors, meant to contain the flooding, could not be sealed because their mechanisms were now jammed by the angle of the deck. More critically, the portholes on the lower decks, many left open by sleeping passengers on a mild spring night, began to dip below the waterline. The sea now had a dozen new entry points, rushing in through these open windows with the force of a fire hose, accelerating the flooding exponentially. The ship was not just wounded, she was being actively pulled over by the weight of the water inside her. On the bridge, Captain Henry Kendall faced an impossible calculus. His final commands were shouts against the growing chaos. He ordered the wireless operators to keep sending their distress signal, and he commanded his crew to prepare the lifeboats. But the list made these orders almost theoretical. The lifeboats on the port side now swung wildly, suspended far above the dark water, impossible to launch. Those on the starboard side were already submerged. The crew's desperate struggle shifted from launching boats to simply helping people climb the steep, slippery decks toward whatever high point remained. Passengers in nightclothes scrambled uphill across tilting hallways that had become slick, angled slides. Furniture broke free and crashed into walls. In the grand staircase, people tumbled downward into a churning pool of icy water that was rapidly rising from below. The human drama unfolded in fleeting, heartbreaking vignettes. A father tried to wedge his children into a corner of a tilting cabin to keep them from sliding away. Crew members used axes to chop at the ropes of lifeboats, hoping to free them, only to watch the boats dangle uselessly. In the Marconi room, the young operators, Cyril Evans and Ronald Ferguson, tapped their key until the very moment the power failed and seawater shorted the equipment, their final message a stark, unadorned truth of their position. The split-second decisions made in those minutes were brutal and defining. Do you try for a lifeboat you know cannot be launched, or do you attempt to climb the exterior railings toward the exposed hull? Do you stay with your family in a seemingly safe interior space, or do you gamble on finding an open deck? The overwhelming natural power of the river, cold and dark and relentless, dictated every choice. The Empress of Ireland, a symbol of human confidence just an hour before, was now a dying island of light and warmth being swallowed by the ancient, indifferent chill of the St. Lawrence. Her final moments were not of a slow descent, but of a sudden, definitive surrender. The transition from chaos to silence was shockingly swift. The Empress of Ireland, her lights extinguished and her decks nearly vertical, vanished beneath the surface of the St. Lawrence River in just 14 minutes. The storm of noise, the grinding metal, the shouts and screams were all swallowed by the cold, dark water. When the last bubbles of air broke the surface, an unsettling calm descended upon the river. The fog, having accomplished its grim work, began to thin and lift as if withdrawing a curtain. dawn's first gray light revealed a scene of profound desolation. The water was littered with a silent, drifting field of wreckage, wooden deck chairs, shattered lifeboats, luggage, and personal effects bobbing gently on the swells. The Storstad, her bow crushed but afloat, sat motionless amidst the debris, her crew staring in stunned horror at the empty space where the great liner had been. The only sounds now were the lap of water against wreckage and the distant, mournful cries of seagulls drawn by the disturbance. This eerie quiet was the first layer of the mystery. The ship was simply gone. Rescue ships responding to the frantic wireless calls arrived to find not a vessel in distress, but a scattering of survivors clinging to overturned lifeboats or debris, nearly frozen in the near-freezing water. The initial rescue efforts were frantic and confused. Boats pulled shivering, oil-slicked people from the water, their stories fragmented and hysterical. The official count of the missing was a slowly dawning nightmare. Out of 1,477 souls on board, 1,012 had perished. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in peacetime history, yet it lacked the singular, iconic image of an iceberg or a dramatic final plunge. The Empress had died in darkness and fog, witnessed by no impartial observer. This lack of a clear, public narrative was the seed of the enigma. The official inquiries began immediately, but they produced not clarity but conflict. The Canadian and British boards of inquiry reached starkly different conclusions. The Canadian inquiry placed primary blame on the Storstad's captain for maintaining speed in fog and for his fatal turn to port. The British inquiry pointed to the Empress' turn to starboard and her open portholes as critical failures. Each captain defended his actions with absolute conviction, their testimonies creating two irreconcilable versions of the same 14 minutes. There was no black box, no radar data, only human memory filtered through trauma and self-preservation. The wreck itself, sitting in over 100 feet of water, held its secrets close. In the years that followed, salvage operations recovered the mail and some valuables, but the ship's logbook, the one definitive record of the captain's final commands, was never found. Its absence became a central, haunting question. Did it disintegrate? Was it locked in a safe that could not be reached? Or was it, as some whispered, removed? The tragedy of the Empress of Ireland was thus layered with something more persistent. A puzzle born from silence, conflicting stories, and a deep, dark river that refused to give up a definitive answer. Official inquiries into the Empress of Ireland disaster began with a single, urgent goal: to assign legal and financial responsibility. In the sober halls of maritime courts in Quebec City and later in London, lawyers, naval architects, and surviving officers presented their testimonies under oath. The process was meticulous, combing through every available piece of evidence from the few recovered lifeboats to the damaged bow of the Storstad itself. Yet from the very start, these investigations were shadowed by national interest and the sheer speed of the sinking. The Canadian Pacific Railway Company, which owned the Empress, had lost a major asset and faced immense liability. The Norwegian owners of the Storstad and their insurers were equally motivated to deflect blame. This was not merely a search for truth, it was a high-stakes legal battle fought over the graves of 1,012 people. The Canadian inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, who had also overseen the Titanic investigation, concluded its work with startling speed. Its final report placed the blame squarely on the Storstad and her captain, Thomas Anderson. The findings stated that the collier had been proceeding at excessive speed in thick fog, a violation of the rules of the road for maritime safety. Furthermore, the inquiry determined that Captain Anderson's decision to turn his ship to port at the final moment was the direct and catastrophic error that caused the collision. From this perspective, the story was clear. A reckless freighter had rammed and doomed a properly operated liner. The families of many victims found a measure of solace in this definitive verdict, a clear villain in the fog. But across the Atlantic, the British Board of Trade Inquiry reached a starkly different conclusion. Its investigators focused intently on the actions of the Empress of Ireland's captain, Henry Kendall. They highlighted his decision to turn his ship to starboard, which, in their analysis, had actually swung his vessel across the path of the oncoming Storstad. They also zeroed in on a damning physical fact: the many open portholes on the Empress's lower decks. These open portals, they argued, were the primary reason the ship flooded so rapidly and listed so irrevocably. Had they been closed, the vessel might have stayed afloat long enough for a proper evacuation. This theory shifted the narrative profoundly. It suggested the disaster was not solely caused by the collision, but by a fatal vulnerability in the liner's own watertight integrity, exacerbated by passenger habit and perhaps crew oversight. The insurance investigations delved even deeper into the mechanics of the sinking, proposing a third, more subtle theory: a cargo shift. Some maritime engineers speculated that the Storstad's heavy load of coal, 11,000 tons of loose bulk material, could have shifted suddenly at the moment of impact. If that coal had slid to one side of the freighter's hold, it would have altered her steering at the most critical instant, making her turn more sharply and unpredictably than the helm commanded. This was a ghost in the machine, an invisible variable that could explain why two experienced captains, each believing he was executing a standard maneuver, ended up on a fatal collision course. Yet it was a theory nearly impossible to prove, as the Storstad's cargo holds were inaccessible for forensic examination after the event. Faced with these contradictory official narratives, the public and the press were left bewildered. How could two respected judicial bodies examine the same facts and see two different disasters? The Canadian report painted a picture of Norwegian negligence. The British report implied Canadian complacency. The insurance hypothesis introduced an element of freakish chance. None provided a complete, satisfying answer. The official door to understanding was closed with a verdict, but it was a door built on sand, leaving the fundamental mystery unresolved. If the experts could not agree, then what really happened in those fog-shrouded minutes? This failure of the official process did not end the search for answers. It merely pushed the quest into deeper, darker waters, where amateurs, adventurers, and a new kind of investigator would dare to go. The official inquiries had spoken, but the river kept its own counsel. For decades, the wreck of the Empress of Ireland rested in the murky, cold depths of the St. Lawrence, a silent monument guarded by strong currents and silt. It was not until the late 20th century, with the advent of modern diving technology and remote sensing, that the ship could be approached not as a legal case but as a physical crime scene. A new generation of investigators, armed with sonar, submersibles, and a scientific mindset free from the immediate pressures of blame, began to look at the evidence with fresh eyes. Their goal was not to assign fault, but to understand the mechanics of the sinking itself, to let the physical wreckage tell its own story. This modern analysis began with meticulous underwater surveys. High-resolution side-scan sonar mapped the entire debris field, revealing how the ship struck the bottom. The wreck lies on its starboard side, the side that was struck, buried deep in the riverbed at a severe angle. This positioning itself offered a crucial clue. It suggested the vessel had not rolled over entirely during its descent, but had maintained that catastrophic list all the way down, consistent with a massive, asymmetric flooding. Divers and remotely operated vehicles then focused on the collision damage. The gash torn by the Storstad was measured and modeled with digital precision. Naval architects ran new computer simulations, feeding in the ship's blueprints, the known size of the breach, and the documented location of the open portholes. The results were startlingly consistent. The simulations showed that even with the collision damage alone, the Empress would have taken on a dangerous list. But the critical, accelerating factor was indeed the open portholes. The models demonstrated that once the ship heeled over enough for those lower deck openings to submerge, the influx of water increased exponentially, creating an unstoppable hydraulic effect that pulled the ship under in a matter of minutes. The modern scientific consensus largely vindicates this aspect of the old British inquiry. The portholes were a fatal vulnerability, yet this finding only deepened the central mystery of the collision itself. Why did two ships following standard procedures end up on that fatal course? Here, oceanographers and historians have proposed more nuanced theories that move beyond simple human error. One compelling line of investigation looks at the unique sea conditions of the St. Lawrence River. Unlike the open ocean, a river has complex currents, tides, and localized wind effects. Some researchers have suggested the possibility of a freak, localized current that night, a surge of water pushing one vessel subtly off its intended path without the pilots on the bridge being aware. In the thick fog, with no visual reference points, even a 2-knot current could have been enough to create the fatal misalignment over several minutes. Another theory examines the phenomenon of metallurgical failure. The early 20th century was a time of rapid advances in steel production, but quality control could be inconsistent. Could a critical component in the Empress's steering gear, or perhaps a key structural brace, have failed under the stress of the sudden turn, causing the ship to respond differently than the helm commanded? While intriguing, this theory lacks physical evidence as the wreck's steering gear is buried and corroded. The most haunting modern theory returns to the fog itself, but frames it as an active psychological agent. Human factors analysts study how sensory deprivation affects decision-making. In the white room of a thick fog, with sound distorted and time perception altered, the captains may have experienced a form of spatial disorientation. The sequence of whistle blasts meant to convey clear intentions could have been misinterpreted not out of negligence, but out of a fundamental, brain-level misjudgment of distance and direction induced by the environment. This theory doesn't assign blame, it assigns a tragic, shared human frailty. Each of these modern theories, the river current, the material failure, the cognitive disorientation, adds a layer of possibility to the story. They shift the narrative from a question of who was wrong to a more profound and unsettling question of what else was at play. They suggest that the tragedy may have been a perfect storm of small, converging factors, a standard maneuver executed in a non-standard environment under a blanket of fog that hid not just the other ship, but the true behavior of the water, the metal, and the mind. The wreck, therefore, is not just a tomb, but a complex equation where the variables of nature, technology, and human perception all intersected with catastrophic results. This modern perspective doesn't provide a single, simple answer, but it does something perhaps more valuable. It restores the depth and ambiguity to the event, reminding us that history's darkest moments are often not puzzles with one missing piece, but intricate tapestries where many threads suddenly and terribly came undone. Behind every technical failure and legal finding were human beings with unfinished lives. Captain Henry Kendall survived the sinking, pulled from the water clinging to a wooden grate. He was a respected mariner, a father, and in the aftermath, a man forever defined by those 14 minutes. He would spend the rest of his life defending his actions, carrying the weight of the disaster with a stoic, public dignity that likely masked a private torment. His story is one of survival burdened by unimaginable responsibility. Then there were the passengers like Lawrence and Mabel Pears. This young English couple was emigrating to Canada to start a new life. They had left their infant son behind with relatives planning to send for him once they were settled. They perished together, their dream of a future in a new land extinguished in the cold St. Lawrence. Their son, back in England, would grow up an orphan, a living legacy of the tragedy. Among the largest group on board were 170 Salvation Army members, known as the Salvationists, traveling to an international congress in London. Their leader, Commissioner David Rees, was a beloved figure, Eyewitness accounts describe him in the final moments, not fighting for a lifeboat, but standing calmly on the tilting deck, leading his fellow passengers in a hymn, "God be with you till we meet again." His choice was one of profound faith, a decision to offer comfort in the face of terror. The crew, too, had their stories. First Officer John Murphy, who oversaw the frantic and futile efforts to launch the lifeboats, was last seen trying to free a tangled raft before the sea took him. Stewardess Mary Smith was celebrated for her bravery, repeatedly going back into the flooding interior to guide disoriented passengers toward the decks, ultimately losing her own chance at escape. Personal effects recovered later told silent, eloquent tales. A waterlogged diary entry from an unknown passenger, dated the morning of the collision, read, "A beautiful day on the river." Feeling hopeful about the journey ahead, a gold pocket watch, its hands forever frozen at 2:10 a.m. the moment the ship's lights failed. A child's porcelain doll found clutched in the arms of a woman recovered from the water. These are not artifacts, they are echoes. They pull the vast, impersonal statistics of the disaster, 1,012 lives lost, into a scale the heart can comprehend. Each number was a person who laughed, worried, loved, and carried hopes onto that ship. Their collective absence left holes in families and communities across 2 continents, a ripple effect of grief that traveled far inland from that foggy river. To remember the Empress of Ireland only as a nautical puzzle is to miss its deepest dimension. It was, above all, a profound human catastrophe. The storm was not just in the weather or the metal, but in the shattered futures of those who vanished into the dark water and in the enduring silence they left behind. This solemn truth hangs over every theory, every sonar scan, lending a weight to the mystery that no technical explanation can ever fully resolve. The silent, dark grave of the Empress of Ireland held its secrets for over half a century. It was a known location, marked on charts as a navigational hazard, but its true state was a mystery veiled by 150 feet of cold, treacherous water. The first serious attempt to visually document the wreck came in the 1960s, a daring venture by a team of Canadian divers led by an ex-Navy officer named Philippe Baudry. Their equipment was primitive by today's standards, relying on bulky suits and compressed air, fighting against the St. Lawrence's powerful currents and near-zero visibility. What they found was both haunting and confirming. The wreck lay on its starboard side, buried deep in the silt, a ghostly, monolithic shadow in the green gloom. They reported seeing the ship's name still visible on the bow, a poignant identification emerging from the murk. They recovered a few artifacts like the ship's bell, which now rests in a museum, but their dives were more about reconnaissance than detailed archaeology. They proved the ship was there and largely intact, but the river's conditions made prolonged study a dangerous gamble. The real revolution in understanding began decades later, not with divers but with sound and machine. Modern maritime archaeology turned to technology that could see through the darkness and current. Side-scan sonar became the primary tool, a device towed behind a survey ship that sends out fan-shaped pulses of sound. The returning echoes paint a detailed, 3-dimensional image of the seafloor, revealing not just the wreck's outline, but its relationship to the surrounding sediment and debris field. For the Empress, sonar mapping confirmed the severe starboard list and helped archaeologists understand how the hull impacted the bottom, but sonar only shows the surface. To get inside the story, researchers needed eyes. That is where ROVs, or remotely operated vehicles, changed everything. These unmanned, tethered submersibles, equipped with high-definition cameras and robotic arms, can go where human divers cannot, lingering for hours in the crushing depth and freezing cold. Piloted from the warmth and safety of a support ship on the surface, an ROV became a time traveler's probe. Its lights cut through the perpetual night of the riverbed, illuminating scenes frozen in 1914. The footage is arresting. We see the ship's massive propellers still standing proud from the silt. The grand staircase, though collapsed, is hinted at by ornate railings. Cabin doors hang open on twisted hinges, and porcelain washbasins lie scattered on what was once a ceiling. The most significant archaeological discovery was not a single object but a pattern of evidence. The ROV surveys provided clear visual proof of the open portholes, particularly on the lower decks that are now buried in the riverbed but were visible in earlier dives. This physical evidence, captured on video, substantiated the theoretical models about the rapid flooding. The wreck itself, in its silent, ruined state, was corroborating the historical hypothesis. Yet for all the technology, the Empress guards her core secrets. The ship's safe, believed to hold the official logbook, has never been opened, its location uncertain within the collapsed interior. Personal effects are largely gone, either recovered by early salvagers or scattered by currents. The wreck is not a pristine museum but a decaying relic. The cold, fresh water of the St. Lawrence has preserved the steel better than salt water would have, but it is still slowly succumbing to rust and microbial action. Each survey reveals a little more deterioration, a slow-motion return to the elements. This gradual dissolution adds another layer of poignancy to the archaeological mission. It is a race against time, not to recover treasure, but to digitally preserve a historical crime scene before it fades away completely. The story of the Empress of Ireland's wreck exploration is a microcosm of deep-sea archaeology itself. It moves from the era of brave, individual divers feeling their way in the dark to a methodical, scientific process of remote sensing and documentation. The challenges remain immense. The water is an unforgiving archive, but each ping of the sonar, each frame of ROV video, pulls another fragment of the truth from the shadows, allowing the wreck to finally testify in the court of history. But a historical event does not end with its final casualty report or its last inquiry gavel. It lives on in the stories a culture tells about itself. The Empress of Ireland, with its potent mix of sudden tragedy, mysterious fog, and profound loss, was a perfect vessel for folklore. It quickly sank not just into the river, but into the collective imagination, transforming from a news item into a legend. This process began almost immediately with the folk ballads. In the maritime communities of Quebec and the Maritimes, singers composed mournful, narrative songs about the disaster, recounting the collision and the brave souls lost. These were not commercial recordings but oral traditions passed down in kitchens and taverns, keeping the memory alive in the very communities most affected. The songs served as communal mourning, a way to process a grief too large for any one family to hold. They framed the event in the timeless language of sea shanties and tragic tales, connecting the Empress to a long lineage of maritime doom. This folk tradition found its most famous descendant decades later, though for a different ship. When Canadian singer-songwriter Gordon Lightfoot penned his epic ballad, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, in 1976, he was working squarely within this tradition. His haunting refrain, "The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down of the big lake they call Gitchgumi," could just as easily apply to the St. Lawrence. Lightfoot's song did for the Fitzgerald what those earlier ballads did for the Empress. It cemented a 20th century shipwreck into the realm of modern myth, proving the public's enduring fascination with stories of great ships humbled by nature. The Empress inspired its own direct literary echoes. Poets wrote verses about the fog and the final hymn. Novelists wove its story into tales of romance and fate set against the backdrop of the doomed voyage. These works were less concerned with the technical blame and more with the human drama, the what-ifs and the moments of courage. They explored the emotional truth of the event, which often resonates more deeply than the factual one. In local communities along the St. Lawrence, more specific legends took root. Some spoke of ghostly lights seen over the water on the anniversary of the sinking, or the distant sound of a steam whistle in the fog. Others whispered that the river itself was cursed in that spot, that the spirits of the lost were not at rest. These stories are a classic folk response to trauma, an attempt to explain the unexplainable and to mark a place where the ordinary world was torn open by extraordinary sorrow. This layer of supernatural speculation is not a distortion of history but an extension of it. It represents the human need to find meaning, or at least pattern, in random catastrophe. The cold facts of a miscommunicated whistle signal are somehow less satisfying than the idea of a river that remembers or a ship that cannot fully depart. These cultural artifacts, from homemade songs to ghost stories, perform a vital function. They keep the memory of the Empress of Ireland alive in a way that history books and court transcripts cannot. They translate statistics back into story and story into feeling. They ensure that the 1012 are not just names on a memorial, but characters in an ongoing narrative about our relationship with the sea, with technology, and with our own mortality. The folklore does not replace the historical investigation. It runs parallel to it, a deep, emotional current that continues to flow long after the official inquiries have closed their files. The story of the Empress of Ireland finds echoes in a long, haunting chorus of ships swallowed by the sea. Maritime history is filled with vessels that sailed into a storm and simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and legends. Consider the phantom ship of folklore, the Flying Dutchman. While a myth, its core narrative is a powerful archetype born from very real fears. A spectral vessel condemned to sail forever after being lost in a furious gale off the Cape of Good Hope. The legend speaks to the ultimate maritime mystery, a disappearance so complete that it transcends fact and enters the realm of eternal story. More concrete, yet equally mysterious, is the fate of the SS Pacific. This side-wheel steamer disappeared in 1875 while sailing from Victoria, British Columbia to San Francisco. She was last seen battling a severe storm in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. No wreckage was ever found, and all approximately 275 people on board were lost. For over a century, her final resting place was unknown, a silent counterpart to the Empress, a ship that vanished without a single witness to its last moments. Then there is the strange, almost playful mystery of the Bedtime. This steel-hulled cargo steamer was trapped by pack ice off the northern coast of Alaska in 1931. Her crew abandoned her, believing she would be crushed and sink, but the Bedtime had other ideas. She broke free of the ice and began a ghostly, unmanned voyage of her own. For nearly 4 decades, sailors and Inuit hunters would spot her drifting silently through the Arctic waters, a ghost ship made real, always elusive, never to be boarded again. She was last seen in 1969, and her ultimate fate remains a secret of the deep cold. Each of these stories, from legend to documented fact, shares a common thread with the Empress of Ireland. They represent a rupture in the expected narrative. A ship leaves port, encounters a storm, and then the story stops. The evidence is gone, the voices are silenced. This creates a vacuum, and into that vacuum rush theories, folklore, and an enduring need to know. The Empress, with its fog and conflicting testimony, sits squarely in this tradition. It is not an isolated tragedy, but part of a broader human experience, a reminder of how vast and opaque the sea truly is. These comparative vanishings contextualize our central mystery, showing that the questions left by the St. Lawrence fog are part of a much older conversation between humanity and the unforgiving power of the ocean. That enduring need to know, that pull toward the unsolved, is rooted deep within our own psychology. Maritime disasters like the Empress of Ireland strike a unique chord because they force us to confront the human mind at its absolute limits, both in the moment of crisis and in the long aftermath. For those on board, the psychology was one of brutal compression. When the ship listed and the lights died, survivors described a sudden, overwhelming shift in consciousness. The brain, flooded with adrenaline, often narrows its focus to a single, primal directive. This is the shipwreck survival mentality, For some, it manifested as a hyper-efficient calm, a tunnel vision that allowed them to methodically kick out a porthole or guide a stranger toward a railing. For others, it triggered a paralyzing freeze, a cognitive shutdown in the face of too much sensory overload, the cold, the darkness, the screams, the impossible angle of the world. There was rarely time for grand heroism or complex decision-making, only for instinct and ingrained habit. The Salvation Army members singing a hymn were not merely being pious, they were engaging in a profound psychological act. In the face of chaos, they reached for a familiar, comforting ritual, a known script that provided order and meaning in the final, terrifying minutes. Their choice was a powerful testament to how the human mind seeks narrative, even in the void. For the families left on shore, the psychology was one of suspended grief, compounded by the mysteries of the deep. A death on land typically comes with a body, a grave, a tangible place to mourn. A death at sea, especially in a disaster of this scale, often denies that closure. A wife in Liverpool or a son in Toronto received a telegram stating their loved one was lost, a word that carries a specific, agonizing ambiguity: lost, not dead. Lost in the water, lost in the records, lost to understanding. This lack of a definitive end can trap survivors in a state of prolonged, unresolved trauma. Their minds are left to loop through unanswerable questions. Did he suffer? Was she afraid? Could I have done something? The official inquiries, with their conflicting verdicts, offered little solace. They provided facts but not feeling, blame but not comfort. This created a second tragedy, a psychological shipwreck on dry land, where families were adrift in a sea of paperwork, legal battles, and haunting uncertainty. Their mourning had no focal point, no wreck to visit, only the vast, indifferent stretch of the St. Lawrence River. So why, generations later, do we remain captivated? Why does this specific mystery, and others like it, hold such power over our imagination? The answer lies in a powerful psychological cocktail. First, there is the element of the contained, solvable puzzle. A ship is a finite world with a known passenger list, a set course, and mechanical parts. We instinctively feel that if we could just reassemble the sequence, the whistle signals, the helm orders, the water flow, we could solve it. It presents a chaos that seems, in theory, reorderable. This taps into the same part of our brain engaged by true crime or detective stories, a deep-seated desire to restore order, to find the why behind the senseless. Second, these events are ultimate what-if scenarios. They invite us to psychologically insert ourselves into the story. What would I have done? Would I have kept my head and found a way out, or would I have frozen? This mental simulation is not morbid. It is a form of subconscious preparation, a way to test our own resilience against the unimaginable from the safety of our own minds. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, maritime mysteries like the Empress Force are reckoning with scale. They pit individual human lives with all their small hopes and fears against the monumental, impersonal forces of nature and fate. We see the confident, gleaming liner, a symbol of human achievement, and then we see the fog, the cold water, the silent riverbed. The story becomes a powerful metaphor for our own vulnerability. It reminds us that progress is fragile, that control is an illusion, and that history can turn on a single, misheard sound in the dark. Our fascination is in part a form of collective processing. By revisiting the story, by trying to map its contours and listen to its echoes, we are not just solving a nautical puzzle. We are navigating our own relationship with uncertainty, with loss, and with the deep, quiet awe we feel when we stand at the edge of a vast, dark sea, wondering what stories it still holds beneath the surface. The roar of the storm you hear is not a single recording, but a carefully woven tapestry of sound. Creating a historically evocative yet sleep-conducive audio landscape is an art form in itself, a delicate process of building and then taming nature's fury. It begins with Foley artistry, the craft of creating sound effects from everyday objects. To replicate the deep, wooden groan of a ship's hull under stress, a sound designer might slowly twist and bend a large, empty wooden crate, its nails protesting with a metallic creak. The sharp crack of a splintering mast could be the sound of snapping celery stalks, amplified and layered to feel substantial. The rush of water against a wooden deck is often created by sloshing buckets of water in a shallow trough, while the distant, mournful blast of a steam whistle might be a modified recording of an old tea kettle or a train horn, filtered to sound distant and ghostly. These handmade sounds provide the intimate textural details that make the scene feel physically real, connecting you to the material world of the ship. But a storm needs scale. This is where archival recordings and digital sound design enter. Authentic, vintage recordings of actual ocean storms from the early 20th century are rare, but when they exist, they provide a priceless foundation. The true, chaotic roar of the Atlantic or the rhythmic crash of waves on a rocky shore. These archival sounds are the bedrock, but they are often incomplete or too harsh for a relaxing experience. Digital sound design then sculpts this raw material. Using sophisticated software, audio engineers can isolate specific frequencies like the low, rumbling undertone of the sea and enhance it to create a constant, soothing drone. They can take the sharp, startling crack of thunder and soften its attack, rounding the edges of the sound so it becomes a deep, resonant boom that rolls through the audio space without causing a startle. The most critical task is achieving that careful balance. The soundscape must retain enough dramatic texture to tell the story. You should hear the wind, the groaning ship, the distant whistle, but these elements are then layered onto a consistent, unwavering audio bed. That bed is often a blend of deep brown noise, which mimics the low-frequency rumble of a storm, and pink noise, which contains a fuller frequency range similar to steady rain. These sounds are scientifically shown to mask disruptive noises and promote relaxation by providing a constant, predictable sonic environment. The dramatic Foley effects are then placed within this bed like distant landmarks in a fog, noticeable but never jarring. The wind never shrieks, it sighs. The waves crash, but their decay is long and smooth, washing over you rather than breaking abruptly. This is the alchemy. It transforms the terrifying auditory reality of a 1912 shipwreck into a safe, immersive, and profoundly restful experience. The history provides the narrative, but the sound design provides the cradle, allowing you to explore the edge of the storm from a place of perfect safety, letting the waves of sound, now gentled by art and science, carry you away from wakefulness. This relationship with the sea is perhaps our oldest and most complex story. For thousands of years, the ocean has been a contradictory companion, a giver of life and a taker of dreams. Coastal communities learned to read its moods for fish and weather, their survival woven into the tides. It became the world's first true highway, carrying explorers to new continents, merchants with silks and spices, and families to hopeful shores. The sea connected humanity, shrinking vast distances with the billow of a sail. Yet this same water held an awesome, terrifying power. It was the ultimate wilderness, a realm of storms that could erase the mightiest vessel, of depths that hid creatures beyond imagination, of a horizon that promised nothing but more water. This duality is the heart of our maritime history, a push and pull between our desire to conquer and our need to submit. Stories of shipwrecks like that of the Empress of Ireland are not just historical footnotes. They are profound cultural rituals. They force a pause in our march of progress, a moment of collective humility. We are reminded that for all our engineering, our maps, and our wireless signals, we remain visitors on an element that does not care for our schedules or our confidence. A storm does not hate the ship it destroys, it simply is. This impersonal quality is what lends these tales their solemn weight and their strange beauty. They are not about a villain, but about a scale. They recalibrate our sense of place in the world, whispering that respect is more durable than control. In listening to these stories and in feeling the simulated power of that long-ago storm wash over us now, we participate in that timeless reflection. We touch the awe our ancestors felt standing on a shore, gazing out at the endless, shifting blue. It is a feeling that transcends any single disaster, connecting us to every soul who has ever looked upon the sea with wonder, with ambition, and with a quiet, necessary fear. A well-told story possesses a unique kind of gravity, one that can pull consciousness away from the anxieties of the present and anchor it in a different time. This is the secret mechanism behind our journey tonight. We are not merely recounting a shipwreck, we are using its narrative architecture to build a bridge toward sleep. Think of the most classic lullabies. Their power lies not in their lyrical complexity, but in their rhythmic predictability, a gentle, rocking cadence that signals safety to the primal brain. The story of the Empress of Ireland, particularly the sonic landscape of its storm, functions in a remarkably similar way. The reconstructed sounds you hear, the rhythmic crash of waves, the constant drone of the wind, these are not random noises. They are a predictable, looping pattern. Your mind, after the initial engagement with the mystery, begins to recognize this pattern. The uncertainty of the historical event is framed within the certainty of the audio bed. The storm becomes a known quantity, a familiar presence, and that familiarity is profoundly soothing. It tells the deeper parts of your mind that there is no immediate threat here, only a patterned, distant drama. This allows your nervous system to relax its guard. But what about the mystery itself, the analytical puzzle of the conflicting whistles and the open portholes? This is where the paradox unfolds. By giving your active, problem-solving mind a specific task, a contained historical enigma to gently turn over, you are effectively occupying it. You are providing a focus that is engaging but ultimately low stakes, a puzzle with no deadline for a solution. This focused engagement acts like a magnet for scattered thoughts. Instead of your mind racing through your own to-do lists or worries, it is invited to wander the foggy decks of a ship from a century ago. It is a form of directed mindfulness, using history as the object of attention. The narrative becomes a tool to corral your mental energy, to draw it into a single, flowing stream. Once that stream is established, the rhythmic, repetitive elements of the soundscape, the lullaby of the storm, can then guide that calm attention gently toward the shores of sleep. The history provides the captivating journey, and the storm provides the rocking cradle. Together, they create a space where the modern mind, so often overloaded with immediacy, can finally unplug and drift, carried not into the unknown but into a restful, quiet harbor. Let your breathing find the rhythm of the waves you hear. Inhale slowly, and as you exhale, feel any lingering tension in your shoulders or jaw begin to soften and release. Make one final, gentle adjustment to your position, finding a posture that feels completely supported, as if you are being cradled by the story itself. From this point forward, there is no need to hold onto the details or solve the mystery. Your only task is to listen and to let go. Allow the deep, resonant sound of the sea to become the only thought you need to follow. The distant groan of the ship's hull is not a signal to analyze, but a deep, familiar tone that anchors you in the present moment. The whistle in the fog is now just a sound, fading into the gentle white noise of history. With every breath out, imagine yourself sinking a little deeper into relaxation, as if you are drifting down through calm, dark water, safe and weightless. The narrative will continue to unfold around you, but you are no longer a detective piecing it together. You are a listener being carried by its current. Let the voices of the past and the power of the storm become a blanket of sound, wrapping around you, separating you from the worries of the day. Your eyelids are heavy. The darkness behind them is a peaceful, deep ocean. Simply breathe and let the sound of a century-old sea rock you gently toward rest. 14 minutes after the collision, the river was still. The last bubbles of air had broken the surface, the final cries had faded, and the fog, as if satisfied, began to dissipate under the approaching dawn. The storm of human activity and natural force had passed, leaving behind a cold, quiet expanse dotted with wreckage, and the stunned, shivering survivors pulled onto rescue boats. This was not an end, but a transformation. The immediate chaos of the Empress of Ireland was over, but the long, quiet work of memory and meaning was just beginning. On shore, the practical responses unfolded with a heavy heart. A temporary morgue was established in the village of Rimouski, where townspeople brought blankets and hot drinks to the rescuers and the few survivors. Identifications were made where possible, a grim and sorrowful task. Many of the lost, however, remained where they fell, their final resting place the ship itself, now a tomb sealed by 150 feet of dark water. In the years that followed, physical memorials rose to give the grief a place to land. A majestic stone monument was erected at the Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Toronto, bearing the names of the 170 Salvation Army members who perished. In St. Louis, Quebec, a simple cross overlooks the river near the disaster site. These stones do not answer the historical questions, but they perform a different, equally vital function. They mark the loss, making the vast, impersonal statistics of the tragedy touchable and specific. They are anchors for remembrance, ensuring that the 1,012 are not forgotten by geography. From the tragedy also came concrete change, a legacy written in steel and regulation. The rapid sinking, so heavily influenced by the open portholes, led to a major revision in international maritime safety rules. New regulations mandated that all lower deck portholes on passenger vessels be fitted with robust, permanent deadlights, heavy metal covers that could be sealed shut from the inside in an emergency, preventing the catastrophic flooding that doomed the Empress. The disaster also accelerated the adoption of more comprehensive lifeboat drills for passengers and stricter standards for watertight compartmentalization. While the Titanic disaster 2 years earlier had sparked a conversation about lifeboats for all, the Empress of Ireland underscored a more subtle point, that a ship's own design could become an accomplice to the sea. The lessons learned in the inquiry rooms were hammered into the blueprints of every ship that followed, a silent tribute to those lost. The story itself found guardians. Local historians in Quebec, descendants of victims, and dedicated maritime archaeologists took up the role of keepers. They collected newspaper clippings, personal letters, and survivor testimonies. They fought to have the wreck site recognized as a protected historical grave, which it finally was in the 1990s, safeguarding it from looters. Museums, particularly the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau and the Empress of Ireland Pavilion in Rimouski, carefully preserved the artifacts, the pocket watches stopped at 2:10, the china from the dining saloon, the ship's bell. They do not display these items as mere curiosities, but as sacred fragments, each one a conduit back to a real person on a real journey. The narrative is kept alive not to sensationalize but to honor. So while the central mystery of the whistles in the fog may never be definitively solved, the legacy of the Empress of Ireland is secure. It lives in the stronger ships that sailed after her, in the quiet dignity of stone memorials on windy bluffs, and in the careful work of those who refused to let the story fade into the depths. The storm abated, but the echo it left behind continues to shape our understanding of the sea, of safety, and of the profound responsibility that comes with memory itself. The world grew quiet again. The thunderous roar of the inrushing water has faded into a memory, and the last echoes of the ship's final groans have dissolved into the deep. What remains is a different kind of soundscape, one of profound and gentle peace. Listen now to the soft, rhythmic lapping of waves against a solitary piece of floating wood, a steady, slow pulse like a calming heartbeat. In the distance, a lone seabird calls out, its cry not one of alarm, but a lonely, melodic note that stretches across the vast, open water. You can hear the gentle creak of debris, a piece of timber rocking softly on the swells, a sound so slight it almost blends with the whisper of your own breathing. The wind, once a moaning force, is now just a faint sigh, brushing over the surface of the river, carrying with it the clean, cold scent of pre-dawn air. This is the calm after the storm, the world settling back into its natural rhythms. There is no urgency here, no conflict, only the quiet reconciliation of elements. The water is not an adversary now, but a blanket smoothing over the rough edges of the event. These sounds are not empty silence, they are a full, rich quietude. They tell your nervous system a clear, reassuring story. The danger has passed, the storm, both historical and sonic, is over. This peaceful aftermath is the final gift of the narrative, a sonic space where your mind can fully release its hold on the mystery and simply be. The gentle lap of water becomes a metronome for relaxation, the distant bird call a reminder of a world continuing on, serene and untouched. In this auditory harbor, there is nothing to solve and nowhere to be. You are simply present, cradled by the soft sounds of a river that has witnessed centuries come and go, now returning to its timeless, restful state. Let these waves of quiet sound wash over you, each one carrying you further from wakefulness, deeper into a tranquil, dreamless sea. Rest as deep as the ocean. A gentle voice, almost a whisper, blends with the soft lap of water. History holds you safe. It is not an intrusion, but a thought that seems to rise from the quiet itself. Let the mysteries drift away. Between these phrases, you might hear another voice, distant and echoing, as if carried across time by the river's current. It speaks in the formal language of a century past. Wind light, variable, fog banks noted on the horizon. This is the ghost of a ship's log entry, a fragment of the ordinary world before everything changed. The two layers of sound, the present affirmation and the past's record, weave together into a single, soothing tapestry. Your mind does not need to grasp the meaning, only to receive the gentle cadence of the words. All is well, the barometer reads steady, another log entry fades in, a simple notation of routine. You are supported as the ship was once supported by the water before the storm. The affirmations return, softer still. You are anchored in peace, the voyage is over now. A final, echoing whisper from the past, this time not a log, but perhaps a line from a passenger's recovered letter. We expect a calm crossing. The hopes of yesterday, the peace of today, all merge in the gentle darkness. There is no distinction here between then and now, only the deep, quiet understanding that every story, no matter how turbulent, eventually finds its way to a calm shore. Listen to the layers and let them carry you down into a rest as profound and quiet as the riverbed itself, where history finally sleeps. The final descent begins here in the quiet after the story. The last words have faded, leaving only the environment they described. You are now adrift in the soundscape itself, no longer a listener to history, but a passenger on its gentle, timeless current. The audio bed expands to fill all space, a deep and resonant blanket of sound. It is the low, constant hum of the sea, a frequency that vibrates through the very core of relaxation. Over this foundation, the soft, rhythmic lap of water against a distant shore plays in an endless, soothing loop. Each wave is not a crash but a sigh, a breath of the ocean itself, rising and falling with a predictability that lulls the conscious mind. Far, far away, the faintest tone of a slow, sustained cello note emerges, so deep and blended with the sea hum that it feels less like music and more like a memory of harmony. It holds for a long moment, then dissolves back into the aqueous dark, leaving no trace but a feeling of profound calm. There is no direction here, no narrative to follow. The occasional creak of weathered wood, the drip of water from an unseen ledge, these are not signals but textures, adding depth to the silence without demanding attention. Your breathing may begin to sync with the tidal pull of the sound, each inhale drawing in the peace, each exhale releasing the final fragments of the day. The darkness behind your eyelids is no longer empty, but filled with this slow, sonic tide. It is a space of pure sensation where the boundary between your own stillness and the stillness of the deep blue world begins to soften, then fade entirely. The storm is a century behind you. The mystery is at rest. All that remains is the ocean, eternal and gentle, rocking you into the deepest harbor of sleep. Thank you for joining this journey into the deep. Some mysteries, like the sea, are meant to linger without a final answer, and that is perfectly all right. The best response to history's quiet enigmas is often a peaceful, restful mind. When you awake, feel free to wander down to the comments and share your own thoughts on the fog, the whistles, or the silent ship. And if you'd like to drift off to more stories from the past, consider subscribing for another historical lullaby. For now, let everything go and rest well. The gentle ocean soundscape will continue to play, a timeless loop of waves and wind to carry you through the night. As it does, our deepest thanks go to the historians, archivists, and sound artists whose work made this journey possible. Primary source material was drawn from the official inquiry transcripts housed at Library and Archives Canada, contemporary newspaper accounts from the Montreal Gazette and the Times of London, and the preserved collections at the Canadian Museum of History. For the detailed maritime analysis, we relied on the seminal work of historian Derek Grout and the underwater archaeological surveys documented by Parks Canada. The sound design was built from a library of authentic Foley effects, layered with digitally sculpted atmospheric beds to ensure historical texture met therapeutic calm. This audio environment is yours now, an open-ended harbor. Let the rhythm of the deep be the last thing you hear and the first thing you remember when you wake. Rest well.